So this is fun, and lots of old friends and people who I wasn't even expecting to see. So thanks to the organizers and everything. And if Mike took us up to Mars, I'm going to go out to about the 30,000 foot mark, if that's okay. Not quite as highbrow as or highfalutin as Mike went, but when James and I were talking about this initially, it was sort of a way of contextualizing how technology may play a role without dwelling on specific technologies, though I'll do that. Of course, I've got my, my disclosure slide. I've got lots of hats and funding from lots of sources, but I don't think it constitutes any conflict of interest on my part. And I don't usually do outline slides, but in this case, I felt the need to do an outline slide because after we got talking about, and David Ma and Jim and I got talking about this session, I found myself going through a bit of an emotional roller coaster, and I started with terrified pessimism. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll use the first part of my talk about terrified pessimism in the age of acceleration, which is a sort of a funny phrase, kind of means the Anthropocene, it means the modern day, it means, oh my God, we're kind of in trouble. But then I got reading a little more deeply into technology and agri-food technology, and I found myself drifting into a starry-eyed optimism during the fourth industrial revolution. And so I thought that might make a good middle section to the talk, and then perhaps end on a note of cautious realism. So I'm going to give you pessimism, optimism, and hopefully realism in the next 25 or 30 minutes. And I'm going to start with pessimism, and I'm not going to under any illusions that what I'm going to say under pessimism will come as a surprise to any of you. Rather, what I want to do is rehearse some of the things that we all know as deeply troubling about the state of the world. And we're going to start with the thing that probably frames human existence right now, which is population growth, and the fact that over the next generation we're going to need 70% more food. And The Economist magazine tried to put this into context and said this: in the next 40 years, humans will need to produce more food than they did in the previous 10,000 put together. And I don't know how they calculated that number. I've tried to calculate it myself, and I come up with something slightly different, but it's a heck of a lot. And of course, climate change adds a massive complexity to that. I'm also a bit of a student of history. I've written quite a few articles about historic agriculture, and I've written an entire book on the history of agriculture. And so the lessons of history are also sobering. Not only do we have this challenge in front of us, history reminds us that things can go very, very wrong when we don't manage our food systems, adding to my sense of pessimism. So of course this is a scene from the Dust Bowl of the American Midwest in the 1930s, when a combination of very bad economic conditions, including wealth inequality, unsustainable farming practices, and environmental change in the form of a drought collided to drive hundreds of thousands of people off of their homes. Another example, the Irish potato famine in the 1840s, when a similar sounding set of ingredients, an environmental change event, the introduction of a new pathogen, unsustainable farming practices, and very unequal economics, destroyed a quarter of Ireland's population. We've got more recent examples as well. As we may remember in this room, between 2008 and 2011, the world experienced a massive series of food price crises. Prices went up and down and up again. And over that time, we saw governments fall as people took to the streets, protesting the price of food. So the map here shows countries that between 2008 and 2011 experienced food riots. And if we move from the global level onto the streets with some of the protesters, we see some very recurring themes. So I believe this photograph comes to us from Tahrir Square in Egypt on the eve of the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring itself began as protests over food prices. And if you look closely at this photograph, I actually count 4 French baguettes raised into the air as an international sign of protest. Jumping across the world to Haiti, I believe this photograph comes from in 2008, in the food riots that toppled the Haitian government. Again, we see the French baguette used again, and this time it looks like guy's using it as a machine gun against a line of oncoming riot police. I usually, when I've used this slide in the past, so apologies to Dave Kitts, who's probably seen me talk on this slide before, I'm reminded of the old Monty Python sketch involving John Cleese and the banana. And if you don't catch the reference, you can just YouTube it. So, I mean, this is the framing exercise, human population growth. links to what some scholars are calling the age of acceleration, and that the age of acceleration is that since the 1950s, there's been an inflection point across the world, and all possible measures of human consumption have been trending unbelievably high upwards. And Alison Duncan, who's at the back, you'll recognize this was Sam Meyer's slide from the Aero Food Institute Summit last year that we chaired. Sam gave me his slides. The Great Acceleration is also about human impacts, and on every possible continent and every possible ecosphere, we see this accelerating impact. And this all means that I'm very pessimistic, and I end up in a sense of angst and anxiety about my children's future. And I'd love to believe, Mike, that in 300 years we'll have boots on Mars, but I think there's some things we've got to do between 30 years. Well, maybe we can get that terraforming project going faster. But when I tell the story of food security in this way, it reduces it in some ways to a production question. Can we produce enough for this age of acceleration? And if only it were that simple. We actually have a much more complicated task at hand. We actually produce enough food on the planet. If you look up FAO data, there is close to 3,000 calories available per person per day, yet we don't distribute it well. And to illustrate the distribution question, I can't help but want to introduce you, if you don't know this, to The Hungry Planet by Peter Menzel and Faith DeLuzio. It's a photo essay published about 5 or 6 years ago. The journalists took formal family portraits where they around the world where they posed each family with a week's worth of groceries. I'm seeing some nodding heads. Obviously, people in this room know this one. The Revis family from North Carolina, $85 per person per week, and the American diet. And the Ntomo's family from Mali, $1.75 per person per week, and a very different diet. This issue of equality came home to me about 6 months ago, and I don't know which of you in this room might have read this report, but this is the annual State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, published by UNICEF, Food and Ag Organization, WHO, etc. And it was extremely depressing for me. It indicated that for probably the first time in history, we're living in a world where both hunger and obesity are rising. So we've known that obesity has been rising for decades. That's especially in the developed world, but now in the global south. We know that. But throughout my life, almost every year, hunger has come steadily down, both as the number of hungry people and as the proportion of hungry people. But in 2014, we hit an inflection point. And 2018's State of the Food Security Report indicated that for 3 years in a row, we've seen a rise in both hungry proportional and hungry absolute numbers of people. So we live in this perverse world where we're both having not just haves and have-nots, but too muches and not enoughs. We also have to ask the question, are we eating the right kind of food? And again, apologies, a few of you I know have seen this slide. We published the actual data for it in the fall in PLOS One, so you can look up the real data. This is a cartoon of an earlier version of the analysis than when we published. But what I'm about to show is what we should be eating according to Harvard Healthy Eating Plate Model versus what the FAO says we're producing at a global level. And we all know that we should be eating those 50% fruits and vegetables. Canada Food Guide, the new Canada Food Guide, the Eat Lancet report, all say basically the same thing. Only about 3 or 4 servings of fruits and vegetables per person is what's being produced daily right now. So we're chronically short of fruits and vegetables. And if we all ate the Canadian Food Guide, the world would run out of fruits and vegetables very quickly. Cereals and starches should be whole grains, should be 1/5 of our diet, yet represent a huge proportion of the global food supply. And that's not livestock feed, that's human consumption, cereals and starches. Oils and fats we really overproduce. Meats and alternatives and dairy products. You know, there's so much debate in the literature and amongst nutritionists as to what and how much of these categories we should be eating. I don't want to draw too many conclusions about that. But the kicker then is the sugars that we should be cutting back on that represent a big proportion of the global food supply. So not only are we facing this challenge of producing enough, and this equity challenge, we're also facing, I think, a nutritional challenge because what we're producing is not matched with what we know we should be producing for us all to have healthy diets. And then the last thing I'll say on the pessimism side of things, before turning the lens and becoming a little more optimistic, is that of waste. We know that about a third of the world's food is wasted. And Metro Vancouver has spent a lot of effort on this issue recently and launched their Love Food, Hate Waste program. And here are 3 sobering, in my opinion, statistics that come from Metro Vancouver. In Metro Vancouver, we throw over 80,000 potatoes, 30,000 eggs, and 70,000 cups of milk away each day. So, in conclusion of this first chunk of my talk, I believe without any exaggeration, any hyperbole at all, that feeding the world in a way that's sustainable, meets the needs of the growing population, and averts major negative social and ecological implications can only be described as a grand challenge, the kind of challenge that will define this phase of history. What we produce, how we produce it, waste and equity are just as important as how much we produce, arguably more important. And now let me turn to optimism. Because I actually got thinking about this after talking to Jim about this talk, and I got researching a lot of ag technology, and I work at the University of Guelph with people like Mike who are filled with techno-optimists, and I share that optimism that we're onto some really cool things. And that the same technologies that brought us the internet are, as one of the speakers said, happening in other factors. I mean, we're in the digital age. And to set this part of my talk up, I'll just take you on another little personal journey. So that's a photograph of me about 10 miles from here in 1975, sitting on my grandfather's lap. My brother and cousins are in the back. And the reason I'm putting this slide up here isn't just to brag about that old vintage Massey Ferguson tractor that is still running. So new technology isn't always better. But when I was a teenager, I would spend a lot of time standing on the back of that tractor on that platform. So you have to imagine a teenage me, and I'd have buckets of fertilizer pellets on either side of me. And Grandpa would drive slowly through the sweet corn or the melons or the strawberries. So I've spent a lot of time hanging out with strawberries, Mike. And I would just be throwing handfuls of fertilizer off the back of the tractor. It just feels so natural right now. And, that's how we fertilized our fields. But with the benefit of hindsight and a Ph.D. in agriculture, I'm going to say 50% of that fertilizer was wasted, right? Like, it didn't land at the right place at the right time. Far from the sort of precision farming that Mike's talking about. This was the farthest at the other end of the spectrum. This was unprecision farming. And so 50% of that fertilizer either ended up in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas or worked its way into Lake Erie, where probably today it's still feeding algae blooms. But of course, the world is a very different place now. Here we have the brand new Case International Harvester tractor. It's about $750,000, if I'm not mistaken, to buy that. And look carefully and just, pause for a second and what's missing in this tractor? There's nowhere for a farmer to sit in this tractor because it is fully autonomous. It is a farmers have been using self-driving cars for years in their fields, and they look a little bit like this one. And the reason for this is sensors, high-precision GPS, onboard artificial intelligence that means that the modern tractor doesn't see a field as a field. It sees it as a series of management units. So as that tractor is moving from a red into a red area, it goes, oh man, we're in a droughty area. We better put a drought-tolerant seed in and change our fertilizer application. And then maybe it moves into a green area, which is sort of perfect conditions for growing, and they put what the farmer might call a racehorse seed in there, super productive, and put a little bit more fertilizer down. And this is the future. We're not quite there yet, but this is the future of crop agriculture, which is pretty exciting, right? We can produce more with less inputs and shrink agriculture's environmental footprint. And as we do this, we're actually exploding what it even means to have a tractor. So here's some next generation farm equipment. They're small, they're autonomous, they don't look at all like tractors. And this is my favorite example. It's a tractor swarm, a series of autonomous networked vehicles, all controlled using artificial intelligence. The farmer, if he or she ever engages, has a smartphone app to direct them. And they scurry around the field and do the management practices. And as we're exploding what it means to have a tractor, we're also exploding what it means to own a tractor. And we've got companies like Hello Tractor operating in Asia, which is using an Uber-like model of ownership. Probably very beneficial for small-scale farmers that don't have the capital for those giant machines. So it's exciting. It's really exciting. And to give you a sense of some of the research we're doing on this at the University of Guelph, I just will talk you through quickly a paper that we published last year. It's led by Madhura Anand in the center of this and her postdoc, Virginia, but backed up by me and Clarence and Aaron. And we took data from these smart machines, and we generated this particular image. And what you're looking at here is a aerial view of a field, but the red areas are areas that, according to our calculation, the farmer didn't make profit on in that year. So we had yield data collected from the tractor that gave us a sense of how much soybeans were being produced on a meter by meter basis. And then we made estimates as to how much the inputs cost and how much the soybeans were valued at that year. And we were able to show farmers that, look, you're losing money on a 30-year field there. Now, this was a bad year, so most fields wouldn't look this bad. But there's an argument then that maybe you could just keep your income, your profit levels high, but then maybe turn your seeder off or have the tractor turn itself off when you hit a red area, or maybe plant some pollinator habitat for beneficial insects, or put in a hedgerow or something. Maybe we can use that information for conservation. So I think what we're talking about is a fundamental shift. And whether we're talking about the farm or whether we're at the consumer end or at the food processor, the technologies of the 20th century, which on the farm we call the Green Revolution, was all about homogenization, creating one standard management platform across vast areas. Industrialization would be another way of putting it. The fourth ag revolution, of which Mike is, I would say, a key protagonist, is all about managing for variation, creating that very bespoke tune to pull the maximum efficiency out of the fields. So there's something I think fundamentally different about the technologies we're talking about today, the digital technologies from the past. Another thing where I think there is a fundamental difference going on is to do with transparency. And these same tools that I'm describing also allow us to take these bizarre global food supply chains and actually make them scrutinizable, so you can look from one end to the other. Let me talk you through that in the next few minutes. To set this part of the talk up, though, let me take you back about 5 years to when Europeans woke up aghast one morning to discover that horse was all through their food system. And the forensics that went into that suggested that there was a company, probably in Canada, a couple companies in Romania, that were selling dead racehorses or knackered racehorses, slaughtering them, grinding the meat up, and mixing it into the beef system. Well, the horse in the horse meat scandal was discovered actually using a technology developed by a colleague of ours at the University of Guelph, Paul Hebert, who developed something called DNA barcoding, which allows for quick, inexpensive discrimination or identification of species. And that's through an organization at part of the University of Guelph called the Biodiversity Institute of Ontario. Well, the horse in the horse meat scandal was developed by another colleague at the University of Guelph, Bob Hanner, pictured on the left here. And I think if you ask Bob, and Bob's a good friend, so I feel confident to say if you ask Bob, he'd say that his career actually went off in a funny direction with that, because he was an ecologist doing biodiversity studies. He's now kind of a food fraud specialist. And he's using DNA barcoding to discover that there's a lot of bad stuff going on in our food system. So the other two people in this photograph, and this photograph has a slightly fun story, are two former postdocs, Ian Mosby and Sarah Rotz, who are now on faculty at Ryerson and York. And the three of us, two postdocs and I, have a book coming out next year about the future of food. And one chapter on the book is called Tuna, and it's all about transparency. And so we were just brainstorming the book, so we invited Bob for lunch, and we sat down to eat some sushi. And Bob was telling us that a third of the seafood in Canada is fraudulently sold. A third. 1 bite in 3. And I remember sort of poo-pooing that and thinking, oh, come on, Bob, you're a bit of a conspiracy nut. Really? And so if you look closely, Ian's got a little bag, and we grabbed some bags at the corner store, and we took the tuna back to his lab. And none of the tuna we ate that day was tuna. It was escalar, which is an oily bycatch of the tuna trade, which is banned in Japan and banned in Italy because it gives a percentage of us really explosive acidic diarrhea. That's what we ate. Yay! With that being said, tools like DNA barcoding allow us to become more transparent. And then you add a biotracer, like DNA barcoding, with things like blockchain, which is this computerized ledger system that essentially allows us to keep track of transactions across complicated chains. And we've got a blockchain project led by our Vice President Research, Malcolm Campbell, at the university. And you put the biotracers together with the blockchain, and you actually have the ability to put transparency, hyper-transparency, into the food system. So an example of this here is an Ontario company based around Peterborough called Grain Discovery that created a blockchain-enabled, biotracer-supported transparency system that's operational today. So if you go to a high-end grocery store, and I'm trying to get them I'm trying to get this into Market Fresh in downtown Guelph. Well, if you can get this particular variety of tofu, it comes with a QR code. And actually, I actually used my phone on this slide to test this QR code. So you could come up here with your phone and scan that QR code, and you'd be taken to this. It's the story of the soybeans, and this is the story of the tofu. We begin on the top left-hand corner with the certified seed. It then gets transited to the farm. It arrives at the grain elevator. It goes to the food manufacturer. Each step along the way is carefully documented and includes some third-party validation. So this is what we mean by hyper-transparency, and it's moving us in a very exciting way where safety, nutrition, allergies, sustainability will all be much better accounted for using these sort of systems. The final thing I wanted to say about optimism is also, not only are we going to get precision nutrition, precision agriculture, precision everything, not only are we going to get hyper-transparency, we're also going to get novel food ingredients. And I don't really want to spend a lot of time on this, except to say, man, there's a lot of stuff going on right now. Holy cow. So, I mean, the President's Choice cricket grillions, I've heard they can't keep them on the shelves. And that's, again, based in a company from Peterborough, Ontario. The Light Life burger on the right will be for sale, I believe, under the label of Maple Leaf's label in Canadian grocery stores within the next 2 months. Jim and I were just talking, you know, Impossible Meats is IPOing this week, and will probably, I mean, they're talking a $35 float share price. I mean, it's crazy what's going on. And the future is very, very different in the food ingredient sector. So, my conclusion of optimism, Ag 4.0, the digital agricultural revolution, whatever you want to call it, it's on us. It promises to change what we eat, how we produce, and pretty much everything about our food system. And I think the Internet of Everything in agri-food means novel ingredients, hyper-transparency, and precision farming, and precision nutrition. I should have added the and nutrition on that slide. I think it allows us, at a system level, the potential to micromanage the food system, reduce wastes, and improve outputs. And I really do think that that is real. But with that being said, let's be a little more realistic here. Let's bring this back down to earth and shed the techno-optimistic lens that I was just extolling. There's a few lessons that I've gleaned from working in this field in the last couple of years. And the first one is actually typified by this slide that I showed you a few minutes ago. So this is that profitability map. Where the red areas are unprofitable and the green areas are profitable, and maybe if a farmer had this information, they could plant the red areas with pollinator habitat. So I've been in a lot of workshops where this sort of information is presented to farmers, and often it elicits two responses. The first is, farmers typically lean back in their chair and go, yeah, I know that area is not very good. So is this technology really telling us something the farmers don't already know? Not sure about that. There's actually a more profound conversation that came up at one of these workshops that Sarah and Ian, the two postdocs, were at. And we were observing this conversation. And one farmer sort of jumped up and pointed to a red area on one of the maps. It wasn't this one. And pointed to it and said, oh man, that area, it's got shade trees across it. We should cut the trees down and then we can plant harder. And the conservationists that sort of had presented it kind of laughed nervously and awkwardly because the farmer had come to the opposite conclusion as to what we were hoping they'd come to. They hadn't said, oh, we should plant more beneficial insect habitat. They said we should get rid of that biodiversity and farm harder. And on one level, you could sort of be a little cynical about the response of the farmers, but I think it reveals an important point. And the point is that if the reason that farmers are farming hard is that their inputs are high, their commodity prices are low and uncertain, they've got mortgages to pay on their equipment, and they're paying rent on their land, then better technology isn't going to change the rules of the game that they're operating on. So the lesson that I sort of took from that is the system of incentives that farmers are operating under probably matters more than the technology. So while the technology gives us these potentials, if the system of incentives is kind of screwy, then the technology may not do what the conservationists are hoping it does. A second lesson, all of these information, all of this stuff that we're talking about is data rich. And in agriculture, just like in every other sector of the economy, there's a war for data ownership going on right now. Is it Facebook that's going to own everything? Is it Facebook linked to Amazon with their algorithms that are going to own everything? Who is going to own it? And if the farmer is sitting there producing data, and it goes up into the cloud, and then Monsanto, owned by Bayer, analyzes it and sells it back to the farmer as a decision support tool to tell the combine harvester when to turn on and off, well, they're going to be resentful, and they're going to not upload their data. And I use a combine harvester example. We can talk about any sector of the agri-food system. And we're having this conversation about social media around data ownership and control. We're not yet having the conversation on agri-food. So I think agri-food needs to catch up on this sort of data ownership thing. And critically, we need to talk about cybersecurity, because we're not talking about cybersecurity anywhere near enough. And I think it was it was either last May, so May 2018 or May 2017, I can't remember which. Doctors and nurses and health administrators across Europe sat down at their terminals and found this screen. Ransomware, malicious criminal activity had attacked the national health system in England and put the national health system at jeopardy unless people started paying large numbers of Bitcoin currencies. So the lesson I take from this is that these technology changes mean that new people are going to gain power, especially around data. Whether that's a criminal using ransomware or whether that's a corporation who's gobbling up data. And so we need, as agri-food experts, to be having that conversation as proactively as we can about how to govern our data, how to secure our data, how to protect anonymity, have the data conversation. If we want agri-food technology to do all those things that I said in my optimistic phase, we're going to have to figure data governance, data security, data management, and ownership out. My third lesson, as I start wrapping this up, the Case International Harvester tractor that I showed you a few minutes ago that has no farmer on it is, I feel, a bit of a metaphor. Another technology I could have chosen is a technology developed by a colleague of ours in engineering at the University of Guelph that's an automatic harvester for the greenhouse industry. It's a magnificent piece of technology. The optical sensors in this that recognize just the right color of ripeness in the tomato are amazing. And then a human being, instinctively grabs the tomato without too much force and twists and pulls. I mean, that's a very sophisticated action, right? Training a robot to do that is not easy. And yet, we've done it. Our colleagues have done it. So we've got that. And yet, it means that this may be the consequence. I mean, what does a driverless tractor without a spot for a grandson to hang out with his grandfather mean for a rural community? And so, many of us think that the robot overlords are coming to get us, and we're all doomed. So the lesson, my third lesson, I think labor upheavals are inevitable, and this, of course, isn't just agri-food. This is economy-wide, and this is going to create winners and losers. But I think there's some counterintuitive things going on here. I'm going to refer to two reports in the next 5 minutes. The first report comes from the Ontario Ag College, University of Guelph. It came out about 18 months ago, and it's a jobs survey of our graduates. And it came up with some very interesting findings. First of all, there's 4 jobs for every graduate from the Ontario Ag College entering the sector. Second, the gap between the number of people we can graduate and employers' needs is expected to grow, and there's going to be an increase in new hires in the next few years. So there's good jobs available. So maybe the robots aren't coming for all the jobs, they're coming for some of the jobs. Second report that I wanted to draw your attention to was released about this time last year by Royal Bank of Canada. Humans Wanted: How Canadian Youth Can Thrive in the Age of Disruption. And they came up with similar conclusions, but this was an economy-wide scan. It wasn't nothing to do with ag and food. But they identified that fully more than a quarter of Canadian jobs are going to be heavily disrupted by technology. And the economy is expected to add jobs, 2.5 million almost, by the next few years. And they concluded that there's going to be an increase in demand for foundational skills, critical thinking, coordination, social perceptiveness, active listening, complex problem solving. In other words, those skills that mean a person can work in a group. Because those are things that are robot-proof. So, what this means for us is we have to do training differently. Because there's opportunities, but they're different opportunities. And so we, as people in the sector, have to get on the ball. So that's something that I'm very proud of as part of the Aero Food Institute. We are actually creating a experiential education program for graduate students, where students do their theses, but then work with me and my team 1 day a week alongside their theses to do work with non-industry non-academic partners. So if you know any good grad students that might get excited by that, send me a message. So my conclusion to the realism part of my talk is we have to be pragmatic about technology. We have to be very cognizant of the lookouts for trade-offs, unintended consequences, and I think we need to change our training environment. And I'm going to finish my talk with one last metaphor, which is to seek a portfolio. And I'll explain that over the next 2 minutes as I describe to you a trip I took to Rwanda about 4 years ago. Now, Rwanda is that small East African country, most known, unfortunately, for the horrific genocide, which happened exactly 25 years ago this month. It started in April and went till June 25 years ago. I was in Rwanda a few years ago not to talk about genocide, although you can't be in Rwanda and not talk about genocide. I was there to talk about food, and on my first day in the country, I visited a World Bank rice intensification project, pictured here. So the World Bank had worked with farmers in fertile valleys and had given them or gained them access to high-quality seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, irrigation, and seen remarkable increases in productivity in the fertile valleys. Yields had doubled, tripled. I bet some fields had even quadrupled in harvest. And as a consequence of this, Rwanda was buying less rice from foreign markets, using less of its foreign currency reserves up on things like that. And as a consequence of that, there was a degree of macroeconomic stability that was really beneficial for the economy. I was really impressed. We then jumped in the back of a Land Rover and drove up into these hills, and the road sort of degenerated to being more potholes than roads, and we were bouncing around. And after about 2 hours, we arrived in a small hillside village where we met with a group of HIV-positive women. And we were workshopping with them on food security and dietary interventions and things like that. And at one point we asked this woman in particular what the effect of the World Bank rice intensification project had been on her life. And she, unsurprisingly, said, well, not very much. I mean, this woman here farms an area about the size of this room. When she has money, which isn't very often, she buys soap and school uniforms with it. And so the macroeconomic stability and the price of rice, that was all good for the economy, but was a world away from her experience. But it wasn't like nothing was helping her. A few years before I'd visited, the women in the village had problems of severe malnutrition. And they'd taken their kids to a local health clinic. And the local health clinic had done the nutritionally sound thing, which is to provide Plum Peanut Bar, which is a high-protein peanut bar, as a way of addressing the short-term causes of malnutrition. But then the health NGO had taken a little bit of a further step. They'd helped these women build up market gardens and connected them to local hospitals to sell their products. Had loaned them some money to buy piglets so that they could raise piglets and then sell that on, and then brought sort of a rotational series of veterinarians into the village to keep the piglets dewormed and things like that. And these little interventions, micro, pedestrian, small scale, but entirely locally appropriate, had a big effect. And the year that I was there was no obvious signs of malnutrition. There were lots of little piglets running around quite healthily. And the garden that I was at, although it was the size of this room, was well managed and highly productive. So the reason I'm ending on this story is I think that for me, Rwanda is a metaphor for food security technology in the future. If we think globally, we need our fertile river valleys to be managed with good technology. We can't, in a world of 10 billion people under climate change, afford not to use the best technologies we can to produce the most food with the least environmental impact. We can't afford to do that. And that's a technology-led approach where we've got precision agriculture and all that great stuff I talked about. And we have to adopt a different paradigm when we move away from those fertile river valleys. And I'm not talking literally about fertile river valleys. When we move into the periphery of the economy, the periphery of society, whether that's poverty-stricken people in downtown Toronto or remote communities in the Northwest Territories, a different paradigm is needed. It's a pro-poor paradigm. It's a paradigm that focuses on gender and local empowerment and local needs. And there may be a technology play in there, but we don't lead with a technology play in that. And this is where I come to the conclusion that we need a portfolio. Just like a wise investment banker would never recommend you put your life savings into one investment vehicle, a wise food security manager would say, invest across the space. It's okay. The world's a big place. What works in one area isn't going to work in another area. And if we're pragmatic and don't get ideological about what kinds of tools we like or don't like, then I think we can navigate a successful path forward and maybe see those boots on the ground in Mars and that terraforming project that I know motivates Mike. So with that being said, I'd like to say thank you. And that's me.
Thank you, Evan. I'd like to invite our speakers to come up to the podium here, or to the table, and we'll open up the floor for questioning.
Sir, where'd you want me?
At one of the first 5 chairs, so that'll allow the camera to position here. Fantastic talks this afternoon. And I'm sure there's a number of questions, and so I'd like to take this time to open up the floor for questioning. Is there someone who wants to start the ball rolling? Yes, Megan.
For Megan, in general knowledge, my question is for Pamela. Thank you all for your wonderful presentations. First, I have 2 questions. The first one is, how do you keep the data set updated, knowing that manufacturers are constantly changing formulations? And number 2, are you addressing away from home foods, knowing that is a growing sector of our?
So now that we have the new database set up, the new food stuff data, we will have updates every 2 weeks. And we've told all of the participants, or the manufacturers, everyone who's participating in the project, that we are doing this, and so that they would be willing to give us whatever their reformulations or updates, whatever, that often. But that's how frequently we are going to have updates to the database. When we do an update, we then move something to an archive, so that, and we have it dated when the update was done, so you can go back over hopefully 10, 20, whatever, however long we keep this, and look at a very specific time frame and get whatever was in that product at that particular time. And food away from home. So that's something that we are going to have to tackle. That's not going to be our very next thing that we're looking at, but it is down the road, and we know it's something we're going to do. We are looking at doing the private label. We're going to have in there, we're going to have the store brand labels like Target, Safeway, or whatever. That's going to be coming next. We're looking at talking to restaurant chains to have that labeled in there. And so we're getting there. It's just we had to get the thing set up first and see it, make sure that it was working.
Yes, please.
Well, my question is for Dr. Nixon. So, thank you so much for the fascinating talk. I really appreciate it how part of Dr. Fraser were talking about some of the potential long-term effects of labor on data sharing. So, Dr. Nixon, I wondered, as you talked about the model in Toronto, that being potentially scaled up, are there any watchouts or downsides that you could think of that could, long-term effects that maybe should be, considered?
Absolutely. And before I answer that, I want to correct an omission from earlier. Thanks to the organization for bringing me in here. And Dave Ma is the guy who dragged me kicking and screaming in here. and Heather Steele did all the work, so thanks. But yes, downside, oh my God. This is a technically complicated garden And the challenge, the technical challenge, is actually pretty straightforward. It's one that we solved years ago in the space program. So transferring that technology to high-density modular food production systems with homogeneous temperature, humidity, and CO2 and light even in the aerial canopy, that's the challenge. And then nutrients and water, recycling everything. But, can I say this? Shit happens. And the challenge of pathogen control. I mean, in the last year, we have banned in North America romaine lettuce 3 times, and I think it killed somebody, didn't it? So, I mean, food safety, let alone food security, in terms of production capacity and all that, but food safety is actually what's driving this modular food production technology more so than anything else right now. Because we can't, we've got everything jammed into an industrial space, and the farmer management, the skills required, they're going to need to know the on switch for the environment control system and the feedback control and the iPhone app that monitors everything. This is how we do it now. I mean, I can pull out an iPhone now if I had one. I'm a BlackBerry guy, and check on the environment control in 20 chambers back in Guelph, or the chamber in the Antarctic where Paul was. I can do that just by clicking a button on my phone, and with feedback control manage that. So those are the kinds of challenges we have, and there will be downsides. There will be, but I don't think we're going to kill anybody.
Can I just follow up to your question? You showed that warehouse at the end there. How much land does that actually equate to?
I should know that. I should have that arithmetic off the top of my head, but I don't. But imagine, I mean, this is an industrial warehouse. Those levels are, and if you're growing a reasonably low stature, we're aiming at low stature crops now, so that we can jam as much of it as we possibly can, and it's really just the market. $2 billion for romaine lettuce, good heavens. So the market is there, and the food security and food safety issue is definitely a driving force. So you only need about that much space, but 40, 50 centimeters max between light levels. And in an industrial warehouse, if you've ever been in one, that means you can stack this stuff to the ceiling and ensure homogeneous environment control over every cubic centimeter of that space. That's remarkable. I mean, that blows any other technology out of the water in terms of production. Even the field in Salinas, California that stretches. We can probably, we can enhance the production on one level by a factor of 3. And then in terms of a square meter times 20, the arithmetic gets ridiculous in terms of production capacity.
It's been
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting day, and I was really pleased that we had a discussion about the data file, the food files and nutrient files. I mean, this is not something that gets a lot of people excited. But my point is, all these applications and these new technologies are worthless if we don't have good databases. And people don't recognize that. We're investing like millions on research on the microbiome, but it all relies on the quality of the data you're relating that to in terms of nutrition. And we need to find a way to promote that and make sure that we have enough funding to get that to the level where it needs to be. And I don't think it is. I mean, these are great initiatives, but we need to go further than that. And hopefully we'll find a way to do that. But this is really the critical point of nutrition research.
That's true also in our controlled environment stuff. We're developing an artificial intelligence element to that, and data mining is what has to service that initiative. So we express it in feedback control. So artificial intelligence will slowly but surely take us over. So pay attention.
I think, Nan, you wanted to